Thank you. So I would like to call now Zsolt Boda, who will chair the roundtable, and the three participants, Kutsal, Alketa, and Umut, to join us. And to begin this roundtable about populism and governance, the policy implication of populist politics. Zsolt.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Dear colleagues, good afternoon. So we're going to talk about populism and policymaking, a topic that I don't think that I have to argue that it's important. There are more and more populist politicians in power, and they affect our lives. Just let me remind you of one guy named Donald. So we're going to talk about this phenomenon, and in general, of course, the stake of this whole story is about what are the linkages between politics, the political system, and policymaking. We are policy scholars. We tend to focus on policy making and the policy subsystem, but let's not forget that politics is there and it influences heavily how policy making is happening. So it is my pleasure to introduce the members of the panel. Well, I will introduce them in the order of the interventions. So we're going to start with Alketa Pessi, who is a professor at the Brazilian School of Public and Business Management, and she's working mostly on public administration, regulatory instruments, bureaucratic autonomy, and of course she published on populism in the Brazilian context, and he's also the editor of the journal Regulation and Governance. Then we have Kutsal Zsirkald. He's a professor at the Leiden University, working also on public administration and administrative bureaucratic autonomy. And recently he started to work on the effect of illiberalism and illiberal populism on public administration and the bureaucracy. Namely, he just published an article with co-authors on the Guardian State in the Public Administration Review, and also he co-edited a book on democratic backsliding and public administration together with Guy Peters and others. Yes. And last but not least, we have Umut Korkut, full professor from Glasgow Caledonia University, full professor of international relations there. He has been published on extremism, radicalism, migration, discursive governance that he will be talking about. He also published a book on Hungary. Yeah, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Zsolt Boda from Hungary, Hungarian Handren Center for Social Sciences. So yeah, he published a book on Hungary. And he was also, among other offices, vice president of IPSA. So let us start the discussion. We should have a fourth panelist, actually, Shiru Wang from Hong Kong University, but unfortunately she couldn't make it. So we're going to be just four of us entertaining you here after lunch in this siesta time, which is not an easy time, but we will try to do our best. So I will start with a short introduction. We published an article a couple of years ago with my colleagues with this title, Conceptualizing Populism in Policymaking, and I was just to present our little model that we propose. But first, let me define populism in case you happen not to be working on populism. So populism is a contested concept, even in political science, so I won't go into the details because there's a huge literature, of course, on populism. Some people call it political strategy, it's a discourse. It's been conceptualized as a thin ideology. Actually, this approach is very much used now in research. But also there was a scale of populist attitudes developed, so we can even grasp populism at the individual level. But all I want to say is that I will just list the main elements that these approaches share, more or less. So populism is about a people-centrist approach, where people is somehow in the middle, in the focus of the discourse of the politics. It is, of course, a very anti-elitist approach. So the elite is corrupt, the elite is bad, the people is good. So all this leads us to the Manichaean outlook of the populist approach, thinking in terms of bad and good, black and white. Again, people as such, a kind of constructed homogeneous people is good, and we have the bad elite who is trying to corrupt or harm this good people. And as such, populism is quite anti-pluralistic because they think in terms of homogeneous people. You know, the people are there, the Hungarians or the Brazilians and so on. So all this kind of pluralism, the differences inside the society, populists are not very open to that. And last but not least, populism is generally characterized by personalistic leadership. Ideally, this leader is leading his or her people, kind of unorganized fellowship. Okay, again, it's the populist leaders are not necessarily interested in pluralistic interest articulations and things like this. Okay, so this is about populism, and now very shortly, the ideal type that we constructed in this article. I won't enter the details, the theoretical, methodological details. Just let me show you the model that we proposed. We conceptualized populism in policy making under 3 dimensions: policy content, policy process, and policy discourse. In terms of policy content, Cas Müde, an important researcher in populism, said that there is no such thing as populist policy because populists can be left and right. They can adopt all kinds of policies. Yes, we agree. So actually the first of such characteristic is that populist policies in terms of content are probably ideologically multifaceted and diverse. This is certainly true across populist governments because there are left and rights. An empirical question whether is it true also for one individual populist government. Actually, this is certainly true for Hungary. I mean, from Hungary, from Viktor Orbán, who has been called the bricoleur. So Orbán is really using all kinds of policy measures from left and right. So actually, in his case, at least, we can argue that this ideological incoherence is absolutely part of the story. Second characteristic is the policy content reflects majoritarian preferences and a kind of hostility against unpopular minorities. Of course, you may tell me that democratic government should follow majoritarian preferences, or they do follow, more or less. Yes, that's true. However, populist, as the text says, might be even quite hostile towards unpopular minorities, hurt them, don't care about them because they focus on the majority. In case of Hungary, actually, this is absolutely happening. And what is also happening that the government is following the polls and the surveys, so the majoritarian preferences, much closer than other governments, as our research has revealed. Now, the third, innovative and heterodox policy elements, opposing technocratic policy evidences. So here, innovative is not meant to be something positive. It just means that populist politicians or governments may come up with surprising ideas, overstepping well-established policy paradigms, overstepping policy consensus, or policy monopolies, overstepping technocratic expertise, and may come up with some surprising ideas. I don't think that I have to cite illustrations here. The last element in the policy content is that populist policy making tend to follow a more, how to say it, less of an incremental way, and it's characterized by more radical and paradigmatic policy reforms, partly because they don't respect policy paradigms, partly because the policy processes that I will follow with. In case of Hungary, for instance, we quantitatively established that the punctuations measured by L-kurtosis have been higher during Viktor Orbán's governments than under the previous governments. So these radical paradigmatic changes are more of a characteristic of the populist governments as opposed to incremental change. Now, policy process. As populists don't like institutions, don't like pluralism, they try to circumvent established institutions, including bureaucracy, and somehow downplay veto players. Among others, they limit the participation of all kinds of policy actors. It certainly happened in Hungary, it's happening in the US and many other countries. They prefer direct communication with the electorate. So, for instance, in Hungary, the tripartite forum of social dialogue has been just abolished. You know, we don't need that. Orbán is communicating with his people directly. And last but not least, there is a fast top-down decision-making. Again, in Hungary, we found that the time between the introduction of a bill and the vote for the bill is much shorter under Orban than under previous governments, so it's really happening. And also, and this leads to us to a question that I won't talk about, the quality of policies. We found that under Orban, there are more laws which have been modified within 1 year after the acceptance than during the other governments. What does it mean? Either they had to modify it because it just didn't work and they got feedbacks that, okay, this law that you passed very fast is just not working, feedback from the policy actors, or because the politics had a new idea and although we just passed the law, we will modify it again because we have a new idea. So anyway, this kind of politicized top-down decision-making is quite characteristic of populism. And finally, about policy discourse, we think that there is an extensive use of discursive governance. Umut will talk about it. In terms of communication style, it's highly emotional crisis communication and also adversarial narratives, and it's polarizing communication is quite characteristics of the populist policy making. So this is our take with my colleagues on how we can conceptualize populism in policy making, but we will talk about some of the details and others as well with my panelists. Let me just show one book which was published not long ago. You can find it here at the paragraph counter, Public Policy in Democratic Backsliding, How Illiberal Populists Engage with the Policy Process. It was edited by Michel Morel de Sá Silva and Alexandru de Ávila Gumide, and many of us contributed, Guy Peters, for instance, and Humble Me, so you can check it out if you're interested. So this is about the introduction, and now I will give the floor to Keta, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Scholze. I would like to thank you all for the invitation, the association, Philip, and I almost didn't get it here because of a populist deciding to bomb an airport, but thanks God, here we are. It's a pleasure to be with my colleagues in the same panel. While I'm waiting for my presentation to show, I asked for ChatGPT to create a map of Latin American populist leaders. And here, I mean, you know, the ChatGPT is not very correct, so there are some mistakes in this map. But what do we see and what we can learn from the Latin American tradition of populists? The first thing, a broad ideological spectrum. We have it whole from the right to the left, an authoritarian, strong man leadership. So the authoritarian personalism that permeates all the content, procedures, and discourses of populist policy making, and simple rhetoric that might not be confused with complex policy making. So I agree with Kutzel. I think he will make more of this point. We know that populism emerged from the inherent tensions of liberal democracy systems, values that are disputable, like particularism versus universalism, equality versus liberty, etc. And we also know that populist leaders are very skillful in rhetorically reducing the complexities of these tensions through moral dualism or through emotionally resonant and simple narratives. However, simple rhetoric are not necessarily translated in simplistic policymaking. And we also, another point that I want to make is that bureaucracies have always had a very difficult positioning between such tensions. So, for example, when you talk about representative bureaucracies versus meritocracy, or when you talk about focalizing public policy versus universalizing public policies, we are exemplifying how bureaucracy reflect the very tensions of the liberal democratic systems. However, populist leaders are able to distort more, to bring more complexity to bureaucratic missions. And how they do this? Through antagonistic policy goals, policy complexity, and bringing more to the policy cacophony. I would like to illustrate this with the Bolsonaro example. So if we see Bolsonaro in government, it's not easily demarcated as we and them. Bolsonaro was able to create a very complex coalition where many social forces like the military, the agribusiness, the conservatives, the moral conservatives, the gender ideology, the anti-globalism, the anti-dominant party, the anti-corruption, all of these social forces made up a very complex government. So to understand Bolsonarism, we need to understand that you need those forces, the bundling of such diverse forces to create a government. And how these forces are traduced in bureaucratic decision-making, bringing what I'm defining as more policy cacophony. What do I mean by that? For example, if you take the example of the indigenous agencies, whose mission was always ambiguous. I mean, any bureaucratic agency has ambiguous mission by definitions. So whose mission was struggling between indigenous rights and anthropologists and military, historically speaking. Now we have indigenous rights, environmentalism, military, conservatism, gender ideology, all of that, ruralist, all of these interests bundled together to disputing the space within the agencies. Environmental agencies never had an easy time within the Brazilian government, but within Bolsonaro in office, the mission of the environmental agency became more complex, struggling with budget restrictions and different procedures. So what is different? The difference relies in the antagonism at the center of the government. The challenges, those that would are there already difficult these conditions for policy making. So bureaucracies need to navigate stronger, higher policy cacophony, which is the very mission of the politics. However, democratic backsliding is not just a question of principles, but it's also a question of performance. So we see populism in the rise, and we see authoritarian populism in the rise because democratic systems are not performing adequately. We see crime, poverty in my region, and we see other indicators of performance, economic, social performance, in rise in many countries of the world. And bureaucracy, in this case, being the government in action, is both part of the problem and of the solution. What do I mean by this? Authoritarianism, we know that the very source of legitimation of the bureaucracy is expertise-based professional decision-making. The problem is that authoritarian populists may challenge the very sources of legitimation of bureaucracy, from professional and expertise-based decision-making to alternatives like the military decision-making or the tech expertise that we experience in US. We experience the military expertise in all areas of government during Bolsonaro in Brazil, and we see, for example, the role of tech expertise in now with the Trump government. So the question is, how do we expand professionalism and expertise as sources of bureaucratic legitimacy? In my research, I've been working a lot with what I call institutional safeguards, autonomy, arm's length independence from politicians, transparency, accountability, participation. All of these are important institutional safeguards. They saved, for example, Brazilian bureaucracy in face of the pressure of the backsliding of the Bolsonarism. However, we need more. We need bureaucracies that are able to anticipate problems. We need bureaucracies that are able to be flexible, to give the right answers to the complex social problems that we are facing today. And I bring another case of corruption that is emerging right now in Brazil, a Brazilian social security case. An interesting data that I saw the other day, that we had like for several years, thousands of complaints in the social media, in consumers' bodies in Brazil, and the bureaucracy didn't take care of. So we need the anticipatory decision-making, the anticipatory flexibility for the bureaucrats to jump in the situation before it becomes a huge corruption scandal. Last but not least, another point that I want to make is that I do think that we have been overrating bureaucratic resistance to authoritarian populism. Now we have plenty of examples of how bureaucrats resist to authoritarian pressures and populist pressures. However, bureaucrats, I always remember Hannah Arendt Eichmann's case. It was just a bureaucrat following the orders. And we can find plenty of those examples too. And new research that is emerging is basically showing that bureaucrats are social groups, social individuals with intersectional identities that might resist or not, or collaborate sometimes with populism and authoritarian populism. If the elections were today in Brazil, we have a very strange data. Basically, people like Bolsonaro win the elections in Brasilia, which is the very center of the Brazilian bureaucracy. And this is a very strange data to understand. How come the very elite of the bureaucracy concentrated in Brasilia can vote in an anti-state leader as Bolsonaro? So challenging these assumptions is interesting. I mean, it's necessary to understand the variety of bureaucratic responses once that they are faced with, populist leaders. To begin off, segments of bureaucracy historically have supported authoritarian regime. We have cases in Brazil, in Latin American region. We have cases from Nazism, fascism, whatever that we can look for. Bureaucracies are heterogeneous bodies and share, as I anticipated, very different intersectional identities. Working, measuring, and understanding in terms of research, working and collaboration is more difficult to access than resistance, particularly when the authoritarian are in the spot of the light. And there is, in other words, there is a spectrum of behavior that varies from resistance to collaboration that we need to dig up more for understanding. Just to close my reflections, so I do think the authoritarian populist leaders have the ability to distort complicated and ambiguous bureaucratic missions through antagonist policy goals, policy conflicts, or what I denominate as bringing more policy cacophony in the table. We have different combination of authoritarian populist views of the state, right or left, pro or anti-states, and bureaucratic administrative orders that give rise to a continuum of responses, bureaucratic responses that varies from resistance to collaboration. Bureaucrats may be agents collaborating with authoritarian populist regime, and may also be subjects that resist to authoritarian populists. And the last 2 points, I do believe that bureaucratic legitimacy continues to be intimately related to professionalism, to expertise-based decision-making. However, the sources of this expertise, the forms of professionalism takes place in this new environment of social media, of criticism of the state, should adapt and reflect the new policy environment. Highly performing bureaucracy, delivering bureaucracies that respond to the needs of the citizens still continue to be necessary so we can defend our democracies. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Salt and Philippe and everyone who's organizing this, for having me here, also in this very nice panel with very good colleagues. I also feel myself humbled, not because of the invitation, but because of the sheer size of this room. I normally try to visualize every time I give a lecture for students or conferences. I visualize the room and the setting, but this I couldn't think of. So last night, through my jet lag, I tried to visualize over and over again how it would be. But now I'm here, and I'm very happy to be here, although the topic of the discussion of this roundtable is not that very happy. We talk about populism, we talk about the backsliding of democracies. And this is a topic that makes very many people, but especially in countries which were always considered as the solid, established liberal democracies in Europe, the US, very happy. Many people around me, they ask me what's going to happen, are we going to return to normalcy? And these are questions that are very much occupying ourselves. I want to talk about 3 points, and these 3 points have all to do with what populism actually means for us, for our field, and for us as academic researchers of democracy, of politics, and public policy. But before I do that, I want to also share something that the rise of populism, especially the election of Trump in 2016, also put me in some kind of a, well, it's an exaggeration maybe, but in some sort of existential crisis. You are studying politics and bureaucracy, that's my main field, political administrative relationships, and I just finished a 3-year period as dean of a faculty, so I had some sabbatical from research, and was starting to do my research again. And then I found out that the world was different, that the very topic, politics, as most of you do, had been landed in a different context. So what do you do then as a scholar? Are you going to collect your data, make your cases, do your regressions, write a paper, submit it, and go to a next project? Yes, you do. That's what we are. We have to understand what's going on in the world and why politicians do the things they do and why things in politics, policy, happen as they happen. But at the same time, I also feel, and that's a feeling, an idea that I want to share with you, is that I also don't want to be the orchestra on the Titanic. We can just, we do our papers, we do our presentations, we go to these very lovely, nice conferences, but the very subject that we are studying is going into a direction that, if it continues, will also affect our work. In the end, the quality of public policy, political science, public administration is a litmus test for the political systems where we live. The more freedom, the more you are allowed to ask questions and to do research and go to questions and places that you can think of. Okay, having said these preliminary things, I want to say 3 things. First of all, is this temporary or not? Is this a topic that we now discuss and it's going away after the next elections, when there's a next president in the US, or when Orban government is voted down or Erdogan is voted down? Is it going to disappear? I don't think so. I think that that in the West, democracies have now entered a phase that is different than what we have used to see and to feel since, well, roughly the Second World War. What we see changing now is that where political parties, political groups were more or less within democracies consensus-seeking, now they are more conflict-driven. The idea, to give the famous example of Arend Leipart about consocialism, that was about the Netherlands. And in those settings, political parties, political leaders, they did their utmost best to get the highest number of votes to receive as much as possible seats in parliament. But when negotiating for a coalition, every political leader knew that the freedom and the benefits from my own group, they stop where the freedom and the benefits of the other group is going to hurt. this compromise-seeking, this consensus-seeking forces in democracy are now changed by the rise of populist parties. And yes, and we will have elections. There will be political parties. There will be media. There will be debates. But most of these debates will no longer be alone about more or less money to education, more or less money to defense. It will also be about more or less rights for minorities or individuals, or more or less policies only for my people. So I think that the liberal democratic model, or the Western model of democratic governance, has now entered in a phase that is changing. And people who expect that after the next election things will be better, I don't think so. You see it in Poland, you see it in the US. Trump was president, then he lost, but he's there again. In Poland, an illiberal government of 2 consecutive governments, they were outvoted, and the current liberal majority is really struggling to get control and take back control over the state. And when they fail, when they don't deliver policies to the citizens, they will be voted out of office by probably the populist parties. So this is a state that's going to endure. Therefore, since this is going to be a state that is going to endure, this has consequences for our theories. From my own perspective, from my own field, political administrative relationships, until now, until a few years ago, all studies on the relationship between politicians and bureaucrats were all indexed on the Weberian model of bureaucracy. All our theories were premised on the normative view that bureaucrats, civil servants, should never become so powerful that they overpower politicians. So in all our empirical models, we examined the conditions, the institutional conditions and so on, under which elected politicians could control unelected bureaucrats, because bureaucracy was a threat to democracy, a threat to the rule of law. But with the rise of populist parties, the threat to democracy doesn't come from bureaucracy, not alone, but also from elected politicians. And this means that all theories that were based on this Weberian model or this liberal democratic paradigm of political administrative relationships have no foundations anymore. I could say, exaggerating maybe perhaps, that all the articles that I've written and published that brought me to this place where I'm now are null and void, because they're all based on models of political administrative relationships that don't fly anymore. And that is not only for my fields. Think about regulatory governance. The establishment of regulatory agencies and the performance of they're premised on one important theory there, is a theory of credible commitment. That politicians establish independent regulators so that they signal to the markets, to citizens, that politics will not interfere in specific markets. But when one of the strategies of populist parties is to build oligarchic networks, what is credible commitment worth? The same you could also say about topics that I discussed here, like policy learning. Policy learning is premised on the role and respect of experts, expertise, that based on evidence-based analysis that feed back into policy failures to improve policies. But what when political powers that dominate now, populist powers, do not respect expertise anymore? That scientifically built policies are no longer needed, because the problem is clear. It's immigrants are the problem. Immigrants are the problem for housing. Immigrants are the problem for the poor state of healthcare. Immigrants are problems for unemployment. So why do we need to learn about employment policies, immigrations, or housing, if the solution or the problem is so simple? And also the same like for collaborative governance, a very important field that we are studying nowadays. But also collaborative governance is built on the premise that, that actors need to work together, compromise with each other in order to tackle extremely wicked problems. But what if actors or citizens, which we see in surveys all around the world, do not support, they support autocratic solutions instead? Citizens asked in surveys in the Netherlands, they all are in favor of democracy, but when it comes to wicked problems like climate change or migration, they say in those surveys that they wouldn't find it a problem when the government would set aside the opposition to solve the problem. So among citizens, there's also there is a growing favor for autocratic solutions to tackle complex, wicked problems, and theories like collaborative governance, policy learning, they are not attuned to that. I don't say we shouldn't do that anymore. There should not be studies about it, but the studies that are there, they should at least be revised, like I have to revise theories of political administrative relationships to these new realities. And that brings me to my third point, and that is we also should start to think normatively about our political systems. And the key question that can guide us with this process is, what if, or the statement, if the fact, if elections in liberal democracies no longer produce liberal majorities, how are we going to secure liberal values? And I think that in the past 20 or 30 years, maybe because of the role of new public management and the instrumentalist perspective that we have developed on our political societies, we have come to see democracy as a very minimal, in very minimal definitions. We always looked at democracy as elections, very procedural. But democracy we see now is more important than that. You could even say, and there lies the start for thinking about new theories, normative theories of policy making, is that to accept that politics has become too important to leave it to politicians alone. And that also we have to see the role of non-majoritarian institutions, citizens, other actors to play a much more important role in making collective decisions. So we have to, in this case, for example, compare, I compared the United States with the European Union. What's happening in the United States is very shocking, because suddenly I realized that how vulnerable the US democracy actually is. If you vote for one president, he can literally and figuratively speaking trump the other branches of government. And he is able to do that because conservative lawyers have been developing over the years, since the Reagan time, theories about unitary executive power. So there is a legitimacy behind authoritarianism. At the same time, we lack theories of legitimacy that give more power to, or legitimacy to bureaucracies, to the courts, to other non-majoritarian institutions, to act as a countervailing power. So if liberal values are no longer automatically protected by political parties, we have to look for other actors, institutions, where these values can be protected by. But then we need theories of legitimacy that legitimizes those other institutions to do that. I will end with a positive note, I hope. And it is that I also think that these are very, intellectually speaking, very interesting times. We are forced, and that will be my message, we are forced to rethink the very foundations of the theories that constitute our disciplines. And from there, start thinking anew about what a just society is, what a just political system is. How can we rebuild and legitimize the values of freedom, participation, inclusion, etc., in new institutions that are better able to protect them than we see happening now. We see that democracy is not capable of defending itself. So we have to think about newer institutions that can. And yeah, and with this hopeful, more positive note, I leave it here and thank you for your attention and ask Umut to come here. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So first of all, I'd like to thank obviously the IPPA as an association for this invitation. I also would like to thank the local organizing committee and the secretariat. I'm aware of the work that's involved actually in putting these things together. And obviously, I'm sure you're all impressed with how pleasant and efficient the Thai people have been since we've been here. So thank you very much. Right, so a decade ago, actually, we coined the term discursive governance, and then Jolt approached me to revitalize this discussion once again for the purposes of this conference. I'm not a public policy scholar myself. I'm a political scientist, so sometimes public policy scholars, they just think that we're just simplifying things when we do political science research. Hopefully, we're going to be on the same terms when we discuss this issue. So the book was a collective effort. It was edited by myself as the lead author and other colleagues. We coined the term as a process in which political discourses could become normative mechanisms by first marking socially constructed realities in politics, and second, playing a role in delineating the subsequent policy frames, and third, influencing the public sphere. So some of the key research questions that we raised in this work, we started from Searle's work that some rules, they do not just regulate, but they also create the possibility of the very behavior that they regulate. And this was a philosophical approach to governance. And then we asked 3 research questions in this work. That is, how do ideas acquire roles in effective politics and policymaking, and then reverberate in the public sphere, affecting later key policy contexts? And then we applied it to regional policy, to European integration, gender and sexuality politics, etc. in this book. And then the second research question was, how would the discursive processes enhance their resonance in conjunction with the institutional mechanisms in political context? And this is where I'd like to spend a bit more time. And finally, we asked the question about how they would qualify the subsequent social processes and power relations. Now, our preliminary conclusions 10 years ago with this work was that the talk in institutional settings can allude to an interaction process in which what is text one moment can become context in the very next. And later, the context then operates under the influence of discourse through which political institutions, illustrating a collaborative process between the two. So initially we thought, or our approach was that in the discourse and institutions, they would go hand in hand, and then sometimes the discourse would carve further space for itself using the institutional mechanisms in terms of governance. Thereby, we put our emphasis on how politicians would advance governance even without introducing major policy changes. So in 2015, we had a tentative conclusion that discursive governance could be more tangible in populist contexts. A decade later, we will see that in fact, the discourses, they started to replace the institutional, particularly the accountability aspects of politics. A few applications of this concept had been, in the same book actually that I co-edited, we had a work on healthcare policy reform comparing Slovakia and Hungary, whereby we looked into how political actors initiated policy deliberation to affect public reasoning through discourses, and later on introduced subsequent institutional constellations. And we argued that there's a value in tracing the impact of discourse via an institutional setup, and that can improve our analytical understanding of the processes of governance. So we studied that in effect to comparing healthcare reform in Slovakia and Hungary. A further application came out later in looking into population politics in Turkey, and then here we traced the 3 children narrative in Turkey, which was a completely made-up issue in Turkey at the face of population stagnation, according to Erdogan. And then we looked into the normative making of at least 3 children narrative by Erdogan and how it was embedded in political discourse and circulated for public deliberation, which generated the discursive space to set the terms of population politics. So we realized that actually through using this 3 children narrative, Erdogan did not really have to go through very demanding kind of policy processes, in effect to Turkish divorce law, in effect to Turkish abortion law, in effect to Turkish child care and maternity support legislation. Simply through using the media, he could reverberate 3 children, the demand for a 3 children narrative for the future of Turkey, for the economic growth of Turkey, and that way he could increase the appeal of this narrative and, and continue with governance without going through the institutional mechanisms of change. A further research came on forced migration, where I compared actually the Turkish discourse vis-a-vis the Syrian refugees and then the Rohingya refugees, and how the similar discourse simply traveled across 2 geographies. And here I studied how, without building any public administration capacity, in fact, Turkey was promoting a humanitarian power for itself, and then showing the role of the political agency. And finally, in 2021, this time we started looking into the Trump presidency, and then we studied how the Trump in his first term was practically making policy making by tweets, not really going through, once again, the very demanding kind of institutional mechanisms of politics, and then how he was using the social media to disseminate discourse to convince people that a certain course of action is necessary, and thereafter bypass formal institutions and policy making. And we came to a realization, a few years back, that the dynamics of policy making has changed tremendously. And the populist leaders, they started to bypass institutions, because initially we thought that the discourse and institutions would be working hand in hand, but we started to understand that, in fact, the institutions, they've been so devalued, and then the populist leaders, they were able to establish the appeal of their discourse so clearly that they did not have to follow the institutional route any longer when it comes to increasing the appeal of their policy concepts. So this was, in a way, working against accountability, which I'm going to talk a bit more in the second part of my lecture. Finally, my colleague, Zsolt, Attila Barta, and Dorothea Sikra, they took the concept of discursive governance, and they published this very important article, Populism Policy Making, which Zsolt was also referring to. And then they showed how discursively populist leaders tend to extensively use crisis frames and discursive governance instruments in a Manichaean language and a saliently emotional manner to reinforce polarization in policy making and then to create a space for them for policy change. So in this case, actually, we started from thinking that institutions and discourse would work together, and then we came to a position particularly looking into the rise of Trump presidency, but also in smaller scale in Turkey and Hungary, in other places, that institutions, they started to be more and more devalued by populist politicians. So 10 years after we coined the term discursive governance in populist politics, assuredly we can claim that its expanse has gone way beyond our imagination. The current Trump presidency is, a primary example, but we've been also coming across how this term is resonating in Hungarian and Turkish politics. These are the political contexts that I know the best. But for example, in Britain, when Theresa May was asked, what is Brexit? And then she said, Brexit means Brexit. So what is this? We don't really know. But she was also attempting to consolidate governance through a certain narrative. A few recent examples are the anti-globalization discourse and the protectionist narratives circulated in the US, starting with the electoral cycle in 2024 and continuing with very erratic presidential decrees. So these decrees are whimsical, these decrees are there to grab the attention of the public, and then these decrees are more and more actually devaluing the importance of institutional mechanisms and particular accountability in politics. But I mean, there's also the anti-migrant discourse and securitizing narratives in Hungary that came to fore in the aftermath of 2015, and later continuing with creating George Soros as this culprit for a make-believe problem, and then this became the attempt for Hungarian politics practically to organize its migration policy. The anti-Israeli discourses in Turkey that grew into a panic narrative that as if Israel threatens Turkey's security, culminated in a secret meeting held at the Turkish parliament. So effectively, the Turkish politicians, they took the trouble from the Middle East in order to create some space for themselves to securitize the Turkish public opinion even further. So these are some of the examples of discursive governance evolving from the narrative scape to political scape, thanks to first, pervasive media that populist leaders occupy. This is so evident. The second is very whimsical executive style that either suffocates or neutralizes the legislative through embellishing the public sphere with myriad discourses, threat projections, and inclusive debates. How many of us can see actually where debates in America are going? I mean, one day, America is taking Greenland. The other day, America is taking the Panama Canal. And then there are all these inconclusive debates which are kind of like bombarding the public sphere so that you cannot really trace like what is evolving any longer. And at the same time, we come across removal of all conditions of accountability, not only in procedures, but also to public actors, such as the civil society, but also international governance standards. This has been very evident, particularly when it comes to humanitarian governance and migration management. So these regimes have been sliding from illiberalism to autocracy. Now, what is evident is that this transition is also via a removal of institutional checks and balances, and predominantly by the hindrance of accountability. Now, there is certainly contestation against such hindrance. There are strong opponents of irregular and ad hoc policies, pretty much introduced rather whimsically by the populist leaders. So we can't say that there is no contestation. But the contestation is not really occurring through problematizing the frames of reference that the discursive governance is resting upon. So in a way, the opponents are trying to match these whimsical discourses with also discourses, but not necessarily insisting on the importance of procedural democracy. So we're not really seeing interrogation of the frames of discursive governance or not presenting its inconsistencies. We're simply seeing that the opposition is not presenting their own discourse, but they insist on practically following the inconsistencies that the autocratic or the populist executive has started. The overbearing question is, despite pro-democracy activism that could still exploit the legacies of procedural democracy hanging in place in these regimes, we cannot say that even in Turkey, the constitutional standards are there. Erdogan, while Erdogan shifted towards an executive presidency, there are still checks and balances in the system, also in Hungary. We can say that there are legacies of procedural democracy. In America, it's a different story. So why do populist discursive governance remain to achieve such traction? Because simply the opposition could still insist on the procedural aspects of democracy and particularly procedures of accountability. Now, there are two explanations to this question, and they both boil down to how discursive governance essentially rids the possibility of its alternative. So, if we were to approach democracy merely through elections as a procedure, and particularly in a winner-takes-it-all fashion, this may consign an exceedingly central role for the executive to play. The populist leaders' original claim to office derives from their universalist interpretation that the role of elections play in democracy. I mean, in a way, they represent, the elections gave them the free hand to represent the wishes of the electorate, whilst the procedural aspects of democracy would remain as hindrance. In fact, the current research coming out from US, Israel, and Germany shows that increasingly so the electorate themselves, they are questioning the role of courts, even in democracies. So the populist leaders, they position themselves at the center of the policy making with an assumed full-fledged responsibility that they act on behalf of the populace and the polity. I mean, you would all remember Trump's kind of narrative saying that I know what I'm doing, right? So when Trump was questioned, like, what is happening actually with protectionism, with introducing tariffs, and then somehow creating a whole mess about international trade, he just stood up and said, I know what I'm doing. So how can you really question this any longer, right? That they remove practically all procedural politics as an alternative to populist policymaking through discourses. And then their opponents, they start trying to outbid them with discourses, but at the same time, they forego the importance of procedural democracy. So, we need to take a step back and then, remind ourselves actually that the importance of checks and balances and accountability procedures in a democracy. But we're just going too fast, actually, trying to catch up with the populist politicians. This means that from then on, their opponents are also imprisoned within the boundaries of discursive governance, which the populists themselves have delineated. Therefore, while discursive governance gains traction, its alternatives are devalued to move within the boundaries that is set for policymaking, and this, at the end, leads to institutional aspects of democracy disappearing at the face of discourses which are really inconclusive. The opponents thereafter, they also lose the capacity to contest discursive status within which policymaking is entrenched. Even the alternatives that they may propose, are bound by a discursive setup which the populist politicians have constructed initially. I'd like to thank Zsolt once again, to giving me the chance to go back to a decade-long work practically on discursive governance, and then, to remind myself as well why discursive governance as a topic still has much to offer to read the current shape of populist policymaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So it would be nice to continue discussion inside the round table, but we will open the discussion, and then maybe the panelists will answering the questions or replying to your comments can also make some comments to each other. Can we take this away so that? So what we're gonna do is that we're gonna pick like 2-3 questions, comments from the floor here. So if you have any comments or questions, please make a sign, and we have some microphones that will be brought to you, and you can ask your questions, and you can also pose questions, written questions in the net. Okay, so use this QR code, and we will have some questions here on the screens. We can pick among them as well. So, yes, we have there one hand and another here. No. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you for the insightful presentations. Maybe I misunderstood. Oh, yeah. Hi, Stefan Bösner, Stockholm Environment Institute. The last presentation, you're mentioning that so in Hungary and Turkey there would be checks and balances are still in place, and you mentioned in America this is no longer the case, if I understand.
That was wrong.
Okay, good. Because I wanted to ask you to elaborate on this kind of eroding of institutions in America, but if I misunderstood or it was wrong, then I have no question anymore. So thank you for your good presentations.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We have somebody here.
Thank you very much. I have one question and one comment. I will start with the comment. I'm a little bit disappointed that we don't have an African voice on the panel, because it would have been very, very interesting to see that perspective. This is a region where we have seen more and more, especially recently, populist ideas and movements. I think of countries like Burkina Faso, for example, Niger and Mali, and so forth. and all the recent military juntas that that have witnessed. Think of all the anti-France movement anti-France in the western part of Africa, and so forth. So simply to say, it would have been very interesting to see this perspective. And so now my question is, with the oversimplification of problems that you have mentioned, such as, for example, immigrants are the cause of all our problems, does it work? What is generally expected as the outcome of this oversimplification of problems? In your research, do you find that they actually end up working? The policies that we see in this simplification of problems and blame game, do they end up actually working? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We may pick a few more questions. Yes, Michel.
So thank you all. I'd like to thank the panel and also I think IPPA for creating this space where we can safely share our ideas in this world that is so challenging for some of us to cross borders and to say what we think. So that was my first comment. And to say thank you to Kutsal for raising the issue of, I guess, how we've been grappling with the fact that theories and some of our analytical frameworks have been a little insufficient, I guess, for us working on public policies and trying to make sense of so much that has happened in many of our countries. 3 years ago, 2022, we met in Budapest for a workshop, and Zsolt was there, and Kutsal, and Alketa, Marina, Alexandre, and some of us in this room. And I think what brought us together was the sense that we couldn't really understand what was going on in some of our countries, but we were committed to use the academic tools to develop explanations and frameworks for that. And 3 years later, we have now the book on public policy and democratic backsliding that Zsolt mentioned. And I think this is just the beginning of a process where we as a community of scholars really try to not only make sense, but also create the tools to somehow respond to these challenges. I think we've done so far good efforts on the research front and on trying to put ideas on paper. What I'm most concerned, and I appreciate some reflections from the panel, is on the teaching side. I keep asking myself how we can do a better job in not only designing curriculum at the university level to train new generations of public policy and public administration scholars who do not take democracy for granted anymore, but also for the training of civil servants. And how can we socialize new generations of civil servants into understanding that preserving democracy is also part of the public service job, right? So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Michel. Sorry, now that you have the mic, Michel, can you just present in 2 sentences your institutional hard work concept once we have these several different conceptual approaches to populism and policy making, please?
Okay, thank you. I was not ready for that, but
I'm sure you're ready.
So the book on public policy and democratic backsliding seeks to try to really look at the different processes in which illiberal populist leaders attack the premises of the policy process, right? How they engage with policy making by challenging the very foundations of what we used to understand as, policy making being business as usual. So we advanced this idea of the institutional hardball process in which policymakers try to erode the existing institutional constraints to their action, right? So usually you would have various individual, organizational, systemic level constraints that would stand in the way of the leader's will. So whatever is the result of the policy process would be something that would be filtered through those institutional constraints. But what they do is to hardball those constraints, right? To work to really challenge and push and and break those constraints as much as possible so that the result, the end result of the policymaking process resembles as much as possible with their own original ideas without any kind of mediation. And to us, this is only possible in a polarized political system in which those politicians have sort of their assured base, and no matter how outrageous their actions are, and no matter how unreasonable their policies are, they can always count on that political base as a source of support, right? So that's the idea of the institutional hardball. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have two questions, but we may pick one or two more. Yes, you?
Thank you very much. I need to need to make a comment and see the reaction of the colleagues at the panel. It's about the infrastructure.
Please use the mic. We cannot
about,
hear.
Yeah, the focus we have constructed Trump and Trumpism as an exception. The question here is, what about the longer historical structure which produced Trump? For example, the concept of the nation state or the state itself is taken for granted. The notion of citizenship in the United States is also taken for granted. It's exclusive. It excludes black, not just the black, the non-white, but the non-white as an ideological position. So by being silent on that longer historical structure, I think the discipline in public policy was part of the problem. And I don't know how a discipline which is part of the problem can be an instrument of solution. And the focus on populism silences or erases other concerns or other focuses. Let me be more concrete here. As we're speaking now, there is an ongoing genocidal war in Gaza, war in Sudan, war in Libya. But the public policy is silent on those conflicts and wars. So in that sense, I can say there's a very serious epistemological problem about discipline itself. And that has to be acknowledged and dealt with. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have three questions, comments. The first was about simplified policies proposed by populists and what are the outcomes, if I have understood it well. The second was about how to teach public policy under these circumstances, and the third was what are the historical, more longer time factors behind populism, and whether why public policy studies do not treat certain problems like that of Gaza. Do you want to? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your questions and I think and comments, and they're very, very right on spot. To start with the last remark about that the focus on populism, if I understood you correctly, silences other major issues that are around Gaza, Libya, Sudan, Ukraine, and all the other questions that need attention. Yes and no. We don't talk about it right now because populism is a phenomenon in itself that does take place and I acknowledge in the Western democratic systems that were thinking or expecting that this will never happen to them. And I acknowledge that there are many other people in other systems around the world to whom this rise of populism in the West is, but they will think, okay, that's something that happened to do. Now you also find out how it is to live in more hybrid systems. About the fact that populism might trump issue on Gaza, for example, the issue of Gaza is being part of the populist liberal debate in the country that we see. It is speaking about the Netherlands, the populist right-wing parties are in support of Israel and are anti-Muslim. And as I see a twist of history that anti-Semitic groups, historically extreme right parties, now support Israel against the Palestinians, against Muslims, because they have an anti-Muslim agenda. And it has been talked about, but also those topics are part of the bigger populist rise that we see in different countries. We see it in the US as well, very clearly. But they need a separate attention. I would think that it would be interesting also talking about discourses, how the populist discourse, the right-wing populist discourse, how it uses or addresses the anti-Semitic agenda or on the other topics. But that would be a very different roundtable. But I see your point and I acknowledge it. You want to?
Thank you very much for the questions. Well, the first thing I need to clarify, when I said America is a different case, I meant actually America has way more embedded structures of accountability in comparison to Hungary and Turkey. But it came out as if I was implying that America did not really have checks and balances, so that was a mistake. Just come back to actually the question about Gaza and about Sudan and other cases that you remind. I mean, I would actually disagree a bit with Kutsal. Because, I mean, in Turkey, for example, there's a very, very strong pro-Palestinian kind of discourse, but this is not really evolving into policy. I mean, Turkey has one of the strictest visa regimes against carriers of the passports of Palestinian state of Palestine, for example. Or Turkey has really securitized its immigration by building walls at the border with Syria. So while the discourse is really like pro-Palestine, in terms of policy, we do not really see any improvement in order to deal with the humanitarian catastrophe that has been hitting the Palestinians, but it's also coming to culminate now within the situation in Gaza. So, I mean, sometimes we may see populists practically talking about these big humanitarian narratives, but when it comes to policy making, the populists, they do not really take the extra step in order to deliver the humanitarian standards that they aspire to stand for. So it's a very good question once again, but I mean, it also shows the discrepancy between the discourse and institutions, that it is easier in order to, it's way easier to circulate the narrative, but when it comes to making the institutions, it requires a lot more politics, let's say, which the politicians, they may not really want to take as a step to deliver. So that's what I would say. Do you need to add anything to that? But Can
I? I'll continue with some of the questions that I'm starting from a very, very provocative question. If Global South leaders are putting populist support for national cause of development with massive electoral support, then why should academicians be worried about it? And I think I try to make this point, despite the fact that narratively populists simplify the complexities of the world on we and them and black and white, the reality of populism is more complex than that. So, I mean, it's not about development alone. It's not about majority alone, and we need not to forget the fact no one should be left behind. It should be our shared value. So as long as we have minorities suppressed, as long as we have not due procedures being followed up to implement policies, we'll not have democratic policy making. So, I mean, again, the big figures, the big narrative should not hide the very essence of the current populism. And this is authoritarianism. I'm not very sure if we talk about populism per se, but we're talking of a way of policy making that resorts to authoritarian means. And it might be appealing for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but the outcome of authoritarianism, it's always there, it's always similar. You start with small action and you end up with mass destruction, people being kept away from policies. So again, I mean, authoritarianism in policy making and the complexities of policy making of authoritarian leaders are questions that we should deeply care, and not kind of take for granted in the name of development, in the name of, reaching theoretical consensus around development goal that would never see happening in any form of populism in the countries that we analyze today. So if this was a normative question, and of course, I can only answer normatively too. I would also like to talk a little bit about the institutional safeguards of the populism. I personally don't believe in heroes, individual heroes, being them bureaucrats, politicians, judiciary, whatever. We cannot depend on heroes. We need institutional safeguards. Populists are very good at bypassing rhetorically, narratively. They are very good at building these narratives to bypass the institutions. But we need, at the end of the day, if we analyze who stopped Bolsonaro, who stopped Trump in the first term, there were institutions. He was not able to put forward Schedule F in US. The first thing that is done in the second government is to start with the change of the relationship between bureaucrats and politicians. In Brazil, with the same institutions that have institutional safeguards, autonomy, politically insulated, meritocratic-based, expert-based, those are the ones that were able to resist to Bolsonaro in terms of policy outcomes. The others were swallowed by the dynamics in place. So what are the institutional safeguards? What are the institutional mechanisms that create the spaces for the adequate check and balance between bureaucracy and politics? Those are the ones that we should care of right now, because this can guarantee democratic policy making in short, medium, and long term. So I'll stop here and then continue.
Okay, so some of the questions weren't addressed yet, I believe. There was one, we have also written questions, but so one question was about simplified policy solutions, outcomes. Can we say about that? And,
that was the first
teaching, how to teach?
That was the first question about how populists simplify policies. It differs, and that also relates to the question about what is populism actually. Populism can also be a good force by mobilizing people around a specific goal, about a specific issue. It's a means of mobilizing voters. What we are talking about is that is radical populism, whether it's left-wing or right-wing, that are using highly anti-rule of law approaches to policy. They want to get power on the cost of minorities or other persons. And what they do with these policies, when I talk about migration, they simplify policies, but they don't give actual solutions to it. They make connections like migration is the reason why Dutch, German, French, young persons can't find a house or cannot find a job. But they are making these statements, but they are not interested in finding a solution. If they would find a solution, then they would not have a basis of resentment to mobilize their votes. So, and there are different populists in different varieties, but as we see in Germany, and I see in the Netherlands, it's in the interest of these radical right-wing populists to make problems more worse. Because the more when problems get worse, get not solved, voters for resented voters with a lot of resentment, they will not blame these politicians for not getting the solutions. So, but at the end, they will have this big base of resentment from which they can recruit their voters. So, and about the question about teaching, that is very important, and that also relates to the question about institutional safeguards. So, what I also meant by saying we need to look at other sources of legitimacy, other institutions of countervailing powers other than politicians and political parties alone. I was also referring to bureaucrats. And in the article that we published with a couple of other colleagues on the Guardian state is exactly about that. It will not solve a problem. And we should train bureaucrats to understand that they are also defending the general interest of society. They have their expertise on complex policy problems, and because they are unelected, they are not subjected to short cycle elections. So they need to serve the political majority, which is democratically elected at a certain time, but they also have the task to think that 80%, 90% of the laws that they have to implement came from political majorities from the past. So they are guardians of the democratically chosen policies from the past, and they need to know how these policies will develop in the future for future generations. But we don't want to go to a situation where bureaucracy itself becomes authoritarian. And that's the difficult issue with when radical right or radical left populism comes to the rise. There is no solution. There's no reset knob somewhere out there that can stop it and can turn the situation to what it was or to what it is that we want it to be. So it's always a careful balance between institutions that the other one becomes not too powerful, and what is happening now because of changed understandings of democracy with elected politicians, with Trump, with populist parties, that the balance between the rule of law and democracy is gone. And so we need civil servants, I would say. We already have courts and lawyers who are doing it, are much more aware of their role in the liberal state. But we also need other unelected institutions to do that. And how do we teach that? Yeah, happily there are a couple of colleagues of me also at this conference, and I can say on behalf of them, we are constantly talking about these issues, whether it's during lunch or during meetings. We try to bring into our courses discuss populism, what it means for being for public management and so on. So we are doing this, but it takes time, and you also have to. You must also be aware that you cannot turn everyone to become a model liberal bureaucrat. Bureaucrats are also citizens with political allegiances, so we also need to more about that. But I think that we have come at the time, and populism is about that, what we're talking about, that it now disrupts this balance between being elected, electoral representation, and institutional safeguards. And yeah, as academics, we can no longer, is my point, we can no longer be the academic only. We must be academic because we want to know and understand why things are happening as they are happening. Why is politics going, why are policies going the way they are going? We need to have rigorous academic scholarly works for that. But at the same time, we must become much more aware of the normativity of our work. It's no longer a free neutral. You cannot have a free neutral position anymore, knowing that if you don't do anything, then when it really gets wrong, then you have no voice anymore to do the things, to say the things that you want. So we must become a bit more activist and not just the orchestra on a Titanic, but we also need to be playing our songs and our play while doing something, saving, I don't know, the passengers on the boat.
Yeah, just to add something that you said. So I think that in teaching, for instance, I think we have to realize that how our models, let's forget about the political side, it's policy models. Policy models depend on a kind of democracy, We just don't really, we haven't necessarily reflected upon this, and now this populist challenge makes us forced to realize this and reflect upon this, that yeah, all these policy models can work only if there is some kind of democracy or liberal democracy or whatever, some kind of rule of law, some kind of accountability, etc. Otherwise, this just can't work. So I think it's an important realization that indeed these models, just the descriptive models, depend on some normative foundations. Kutsa, let me just, before we get back here, because there was a question about on online, whether we can give any examples of bureaucratic resistance. Do you have any? Because, or Aketa, you?
Yeah, well, there are plenty of examples in literature. I think most examples are about bureaucratic resistance and fewer examples about bureaucratic collaboration or non-resistance. So we have examples from Brazil. Michele book has a lot of examples, and the research has a lot of examples about bureaucratic resistance. Gabriela Lota in Brazil. We have from US many examples also of resistance during Trump administration, and I think in Mexico and many countries of the world, but we are seeing now other examples about what I'm calling collaborations. So I do think literature is very rich on those empirical experiences. I'd like to make a point to pose a question to Umut. I think one of the points that I want to make is that authoritarian populists, I again would like to this qualification, do not simplify policy making. On the contrary, they bring more noise to policy making, so they make it harder. The narrative may look simpler, and this is the question that I have from Umut. They might be able to narratively, rhetorically pose the policy question as a simple one, but when it comes to policy making, they bring so much noise in the table, they bring so many other factors that is almost impossible for bureaucrats to navigate the policy making that is imposed by populists. And this is my hope, that bureaucrats resist to policy making of the populists because of such noise, because they are not able, to do it differently. But this is the main point that I wanted to make. And Umut, now I'm seeing the emergence of this positive public administration literature, kind of defending that we need bureaucracies, public administration, to defend their role, to have another counterbalancing narrative. Do you believe in that? Or do you think this is a space for politicians to narratively play?
Well, we will see. I think it depends on the legacy of democracy. For example, if you look into the case of Hungary, this is still a democracy which has recently consolidated. You can look into Turkey, which is it has a longer democratic tradition, despite some military coups, and it also has a very much of an etatist tradition taken from the French state. And then now we have a very recent case of the US. But we also came across populism, let's say, and simplified narrative to complicated political problems in the UK, when the Prime Minister simply prorogated the Parliament, right? So it's very difficult to say actually in what cases populists they convolute policymaking, and under what contexts their narrative simplifies policymaking, and then to what extent the bureaucracy can play a role. I would say, in more consolidated democracies, such as the UK, the bureaucracy will always have a role. We don't know, obviously, the future of democracy in France. It pretty much depends on the shape of elections in the next round. But these cases have very much embedded bureaucracies in the way that the states have been operating. But at the same time, many of us, we always believed in the State Department in America and how checks and balances have been very much embedded in their institutions. But nonetheless, a populist leader can be so destructive. And I still come back to practically this inconclusive debates and whimsical kind of political behavior, and occupying the media, not only printed media, also, I don't know who reads printed media any longer, but also social media, which operates practically at the cost of all institutional mechanisms that may constrain the populist leader. Now, in the case of Turkey and Hungary, obviously, the bureaucracy had been really kind of an endorser of the populist politician, because their professional life is pretty much dependent on politics. So in a way, like, the populist politician has already engulfed the state and the bureaucracy. So perhaps there's a need to develop a typology, in what cases a simplified narrative is really operating as populist policy making, and in what cases, the bureaucracy can really put a brake on populist politician. It's a topic that I haven't really thought much about. I mean, until I heard your lecture today, and also a very nice comment from, I forgot your name. Michelle, yeah, I mean, very interesting comment from Michelle. So it is something that I need to think more about, but I would say that it pretty much depends on the legacy of the state.
Okay, now we cannot see the questions, but I remember there was a question about the policy failures or policy problems that led to populism, and we still had this question that you already addressed, Kutsal, whether populist policies are maybe less effective or the outcomes are problematic. And you said that populist politicians or populist governments are not necessarily interested in solving problems because problems can help them to maintain this polarization that they build on. I think it's true, but for instance, in case of Hungary, when Viktor Orban has been in power for 15 years, now it's becoming a problem that apparently there are policy failures more and more in the past years. So now his popularity is going down because the economy slowed down, public services in a poor situation, etc. Inflation is record high in Europe, in Hungary. So I think that populist governments, and I mean the textbook case should be that the way populists, Viktor Orban is doing policies or making policies should lead to more policy failures. I mean, the outcome of the policy, then policy evaluation is a very complicated question. Many factors can influence whether governance is good or bad, to put it simply. But I mean, the textbook case should be that those policies are less good, to put it simply. And I think that the Hungary is starting to illustrate the case, and it's becoming a problem for populists as well. For a certain time, they can build on the problems, but after a while, they have to deliver. And if they cannot, and again, the way they do policies, at least in Hungary, well, it's more and more difficult to be effective. However, the other question, as I said, it referred to the policy failures that contributed to the rise of populism, and I think that this is also a very interesting question. And there has been basically the political science literature have been divided. There is one argument, for instance, by Engelhardt, which says that it's a cultural backlash, basically. So the support for illiberal populism is coming from cultural, attitudinal variables, people who are afraid of the changes, of immigration, of etc. They vote for this conservative populist. But there's another literature which now more and more have more evidence that indeed socioeconomic problems contribute a lot to the rise of populists. Do you have any further?
Yeah, the first question of Antoine Lemore is about the first part of it. To what extent does policy failure have contributed to the rise of populism? And it brings a very important question to the center of this debate, because why is this right-wing populism, we have to be very specific, has come to a rise? And one of the main explanations that I follow for now is because of globalization and hyper-globalization. When the wall fell in 1990 and the Soviet Union fell, the globalization, the deregulation worldwide, the surge of financial markets has caused, and I'm too less economist to get all the factors right, but you see a massive shift of low-cost labor to other countries from the developed countries. Like the US is a case, I think, here. I think that the deregulation and the financialization of the markets there have the outgoing, the pace with which factory work went to other countries like China and other countries was much faster than that the remaining factory workers could be retrained to jump onto the new jobs, more service-oriented jobs. That is also what Trump now has been basing his campaign on, namely to get back factory work to the US. And because and globalization is one important factor. But what is happening there is that many people in the West, and also have to do with the role of social democratic parties not being representing the interest of the lower middle class, working class, as good as they should be doing. There's been a resentment growing. So populist parties, they now claim that they will bring back those jobs. They tried, and Trump, as an example, tries to do that with draconic measures by tariff barriers, which are almost that are impossible. But populists give hope that they can solve it by this way. So there is a displacement of labor to other countries, and left a lot of people, a large part of the population behind that could not, and the government did not provide educational and training programs to prepare people for newer jobs, for the newer developing economies. And there's also this, and also because of another line of story which has to do with this, is that especially in the Netherlands, which in Amsterdam as a financial center has been a safe haven for funds and financial streams coming from Russia and other oligarchic countries. So you could say that the rule of law in the Netherlands has worked better for the interest of the big financial companies than for the interest of the more needy persons. Mostly highly educated people with better jobs, they only have to do with the government when they need a new passport. But if you are unemployed, a single mother, 3 children, you live in a shabby house, one of your children is a problem, you yourself have health problems, you are subjected to an incredible regime by the welfare state. The welfare state, they can really repressively control you. So over the long run, you see that through this globalization, deregulation, the coming to power of the financial markets, you see that national states have lost their grip on things as organizing their labor market, organizing social welfare systems, left behind their own citizens who are needy of coping and going along with the new developments. And this is where the populists come in. They also refer back to the first question. They promise easy solutions, but what they do is they capitalize on the resentments of the people who are literally left behind by their own governments in the wealthy democratic states of Western Europe. So the welfare state, the rule of law and the welfare state has not worked well for everyone.
I think it's very important to underscore that even if we worry maybe because of the illiberal populist nature of this kind of politics, it doesn't mean that there are not real world problems that they are reflecting. So they are really signaling something that we should take seriously. Now we have like 10 more minutes, and there are some interesting questions there. There is a question about emotions, and yeah, also a question in the audience. Let me just very shortly address this question on emotions. So there is research now which shows that anger is behind many populist sentiments. So people with populist attitudes are generally angry, and anger actually predicts more populist attitudes than any other socio-demographic variables. So indeed, emotions are there, but it doesn't mean that on the other side of the political spectrum there are no emotions at all. Just an interesting paper by Friedrichs et al., which showed how the emotional content of tweets was characterized during the Brexit campaigns, and the anti-Brexiters, I mean the pro-Brexiters, the populists, there were angry tweets, while the anti-Brexiters, there were fearful tweets, okay, because they are the message was that, oh, it's not good to leave the EU, it's going to be risky for the UK and negative effects will follow, etc. So, you know, the non-populist or anti-populist, because we also have a question about that, they may also use emotions, but maybe different. Okay, maybe let us take one or two last questions. Evangelia, we have there, and here as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very, very interesting discussion. I have a question for Kutal, and I will preface my question by saying I don't disagree with you at all. But how do we deal with activist researchers? I've thought about this in different contexts, sustainability, no growth, feminist policies, for example. How can we maintain credibility when we are activists? And again, I don't disagree. I'm just trying to find a way that we don't lose credibility, because then maybe our research comes from a place of bias. That's all.
Yeah. I have.
Thank you. Sorry. Let's take the other question, the last one from the sir. You.
Where?
No, you wanted to ask a question? Yeah. Or make a comment here. There.
Okay. Thank you. Hello everyone. I'm Reda from Institut d'études politiques de Grenoble. I have briefly two questions about two theoretical aspects of the relation between populism and the three components of public policies. The first question is the debate that, as I noticed, until now it wasn't presented as a debate between seeing populism as a movement of politicization or depoliticization of the components of public action. As you know, like we have authors like Scott and Giroux who have published articles about populism as a depolitization or a result of depolitization of public action, while others like Peters and Pierre, I think, yeah, who published about the way populism contributes to politicization of public action. So my question to our lovely panelists, how do you advise future researchers to address this question, and what is the most adequate definition of political question that will allow to better understand all the dynamics that populism introduces into policy world? And my second question is, as one of the panelists had mentioned, populism is a long-term transformation and a rupture with the actual policy paradigms. So there is one word that we didn't hear in this panel, which is the moralization of the normative framing of public action, which takes even form of physical violence in the practical aspect of policy process. So will this transformation lead the future researchers to redefine what is a public policy in populist context and get back to the definition of public policy as between parentheses the state's intervention, like only top-down approach, and have to observe other dynamics like disappearing of approaches, of actors, etc.?
Thank you very much. I propose, this is a quite large general question, so I propose that we finish this panel, and I'm sorry that we couldn't address all the questions that we received. May I ask each of you like a 2-minute statement and try to address either Evangelia or these questions, or maybe if you want, can we get back the questions? Just
I can do the activism question. I hope I don't have left the impression that we all should now become activists. It's also a very delicate question because my head of department is also in the room. Otherwise, he sees me as an activist. No, it's like, no, we should not be activists. Many of our colleagues studying Middle Eastern studies, they have become very activist. And I think, and I don't approve of being an activist. as a scholar in front towards your students, towards your colleagues, you have to remain academically rigorous. And when you are in class, you are teaching the students the perspectives that are there, the dilemmas that are there, that are all based on academic research, on sound methodology. But my point is more, my personal, maybe personal realization that suddenly the topics that I was studying were not that neutral or as free anymore. Yeah, you cannot study politics and bureaucracy without not thinking about where it is going to. So, and what I, for example, did with the Guardian State and other writings, which I do much more now, is to put in front alternative perspectives in times of populism. Say the bureaucracy, which we always have perceived as a unelected power that should never be to become too powerful. Now I try to show that the bureaucracy or independent agencies can also be countervailing powers, and that we need to make arguments that with which we can see that, and tell about it and write about it in public lectures or media, but as a scholar, foremostly. So this is another way of conveying your, bringing across your research to others. But we cannot stay aloof entirely. But it's a delicate balance.
Okay. Thank you. Can you, Keta or Umut?
Yeah. Well, I would like to finish with the last question that we didn't answer, because it's asking, for example, of left-wing populism, and Mexico would be a good context to study. So AMLO was defined as a left-wing populism. Again, authoritarian populism. This is the biggest difference. What is the biggest difference? Changing, for example, program like conditional cash programs that give money to poor people, conditioned on health requirement or educational requirements. So you need to take the children in the school, you need to take them to, in the health services. AMLO took those away and just gave directly money to the people without the conditions, the educational and the health conditions. Now, strange enough, Bolsonaro did the same. So he also took away the conditions. So, I mean, it's very hard to differentiate at the end of the day. That's what I say, that it's not so black and white. We're not talking about today populism. It's a mix of, I mean, who'd say that the right wing would be so nationalist as it is in Trump in US right now? So we're in a strange times where what was supposed to be left or right is not there anymore. But theoretically, the left-wing populism that blame social structure and not immigrants, etc., and other type of people. So I'd like to focus on this as the last part. Thank you very much.
So there was another question actually there. I think it disappeared. It was about the populists in the global south. They have become developmentalists. So yeah, and the question like, what is the problem almost, right? So the question has disappeared, but I think it's a good question, to ask. But I mean, Soviet Union was also developmentalist. Yeah. Okay, so we see practically where this developmentalist politics end up, not perhaps imminently, but I mean in a few decades, maybe in the long run. So while we may say that, yeah, in the short run, the populists, they are developing their countries, their economies. I mean, there had been immense economic growth in Turkey in the aftermath of Erdogan being elected to power in 2002. But I mean, yet again, look at Turkey now. After the 25 years of Erdogan regime, I mean, the state has collapsed. It just became a tribal state. So while, yes, there is developmentalism, and you cannot really underestimate the economic growth that comes with certain populist policies. But I mean, at the same time, we are discussing now the collapse of the state or the invasion of the state. And is it really worth it? I don't really know. I mean, it just depends on what your priorities are in politics. Is it really economic gain, or is it really like human rights and checks and balances and accountability, as I've been insisting on? I would always say that obviously they should go hand in hand. And we had, we've been talking with Kutsal and last night as well. We had those kind of politics in the aftermath of the Second World War. in the Netherlands or in Western countries, but the shape of politics have changed considerably, like with the collapse of the materialist politics and shift to post-materialist politics in the West. Actually, people started to care more about their identity and human rights more so than their economic gains from politics. Now, maybe we have to look into the question about developmentalism practically from materialist versus post-materialist political scope and decide actually which one we prefer in the long run. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will try to answer the question from the floor about politicization. Yes, I agree that the depoliticization of public policy, this technocracy, can lead to some kind of counter-reaction, populist and politicized counter-reactions. I think that populist policymaking, as far as the Hungarian experience taught me, is much more about politicizing public policy. And I know it's a difficult concept. How can we politicize public policy? Because, well, I think we can even measure it, but I don't want to enter the details now. It means that when politics considerations somehow trump over policy subsystem considerations, I think that this is happening, so it's much more the essence of populist policy making. And as for whether we should rethink the whole policy studies field in light of this, well, I'm not sure, we will see, but I think that there is a challenge here, and the challenge, one answer to this challenge at least to be more reflective, as I said, about the foundations, even normative foundations of some descriptive models, and how this whole construction of policy studies and public policy that we are dealing with in teaching, in research, is really dependent on politics. So I think this is an important takeaway, because populism is there, it's everywhere, it's in the core democracies now, so it's not something, you know, far away that American or Western European scholars can easily just neglect. No, it's there, it's everywhere. So it certainly forces us, I think, to be more reflective about this policy linkages. Whether the whole field is under pressure or question, it's, well, we will see. But let's continue together, I mean, with this academic community, these reflections. So I would like to thank your participation. I would like to thank Umut, Alkete, and Kutsal for being here. And we will close this roundtable now. Thank you very much.